A city is defined by its streets, landmark public spaces that thrive not in spite of, but because of their nature as essential transportation corridors. Cities around the world invest tens of millions of dollars and huge political capital to reshape single streets to meet their modern ideals. The best of these cities have spun up processes, building inertia project by project, to turn their long-term transportation plans into heated public engagement meetings, into complex engineering drawings, and finally, into finished projects for their constituents. A few orange cones later. But what happens when a few powerful people sneak behind the scenes and throw a wrench in the process? I don't have a big enough wrench. This will have to do. Will that inertia be recovered? Should it ever be? Who wants to override the will of the city's constituents, and why? This is the developing story of a last-minute change stuffed into an Omnibus Utah bill behind the doors of a 12-person committee and stamped into law, all with the intent of stripping Salt Lake City of its fundamental autonomy over its own streets. The State Senate's Omnibus Transportation Amendments Bill for 2025 passed its second reading on the afternoon of February 19th without dissent. This is the penultimate step before a bill is approved by the Senate, and this step is the capstone to all of the work done to develop the bill in committees. The next day, just before, and I mean minutes before, the bill was due for its third and final reading, the bill's sponsor, Senator Wayne A. Harper, introduced what you could call an omnibus amendment to the omnibus bill. The senator's new substitute included a provision kneecapping the ability of a city of the first class, located in a county of the first class, with an international airport within the boundary of the city, to make any meaningful changes to its own streets. That's a really funny way of saying literally only Salt Lake City. It's almost like targeting a law like this at just Salt Lake is clear overreach and would look bad in front of your fellow senators. This initial substitute included an all-out freeze on currently scheduled construction projects for the 2025 season. The senator made it sound like there's an all-out emergency here in the city, something so bad as to justify throwing away public money and thousands of hours of engineering already completed. When presenting his substitute to the Senate, Harper glossed over the details of this provision and his numerous other changes.
There's a required road study in cities of the first class dealing with some of the transportation issues, and then it also incorporates house.
The new substitute passed unanimously until some Senate Democrats learned what was really inside and had to ask to change their votes after the fact. Upon this bill arriving in the House Transportation Committee after passage in the Senate, rapid action from advocates for safe streets got us to proposed substitute number 4 from Representative Angela Romero. The Senate had passed substitute number 3. This substitute simply removed the provision about Salt Lake City streets. This went approximately nowhere. About 2 days later, the committee adopted a substitute number 5, with the scope of the provision reduced to only the east side of the city and the nearly comical list of restrictions on street changes cut back. The substitute also removed the explicit moratorium on this summer's construction. Overall, it was a fairly fast process with a lot of pressure to compromise on the details of the provision and get the omnibus out the door.
I would just like to say I think that Representative Ivory hit the nail on the head. I think we saw the process work here. We got your many emails, and we heard your voices, and I think changes were made, and I think collaboration happened, and I'm really proud of that, and I thank the good sponsor for listening and making those changes. And with that, we will go to the bill sponsor to some.
Perks of having a part-time legislature, I guess. A colleague reminded me as we looked through the long list of projects affected by this bill and to think of it in terms of driving off of I-15 and into the rich half of the city only. I recommend you do this as well because a lot of details will start to make more sense through that lens, and it's a good reminder that this bill isn't about people, and it's only sort of about streets. Rather, it's about exerting power over Salt Lake, and that people who aren't driving don't count, and people who are driving but are in the west half of the city don't count. I don't know. Anyways, the full House passed substitute number 5, but the Senate did not concur on all of the changes. This triggered the creation of a 6-member conference committee. This committee, in only hours, recommended a substitute number 7, which reworded the provision a bit more professionally, like using the defined legal term highway instead of road, and subjected some of the projects taken out of moratorium by substitute number 5, but left in a sort of limbo, to a vague expedited review process. The city spent months of work dealing with that, but we got our construction season. Substitute number 7 was signed into law. So Salt Lake already has a very extensive public outreach system for streets projects. Sometimes myself and other advocates wonder if it's too extensive, but these things are called for by the general plan. So I don't think it's any ordinary folk asking for something new. They already have their voice. So who might have an interest in subverting that input system to enact their own vision of the city? Well, we might never know for sure. I don't think I'm rich enough for that, but we can take some educated guesses. From the top, there's Senator Wayne A. Harper, the bill's sponsor and a Republican representing much of Taylorsville and West Jordan. 2 days after putting forward substitute number 3, Harper received an academic paper by Daniel Mendoza and Mark Jansen, both University of Utah faculty. This paper, which you can read below, is almost comically unscientific and parrots a number of talking points that blame air quality issues on street features that make cars drive, for literally any reason, slower. Los Angeles tried building the entire expo line around the concept that making cars wait at lights for the train would worsen air quality, and now they're scrambling to speed it back up and build out a transportation network to save themselves and the whole region from absolutely unsustainable car dependence. Slowing down cars is bad for the air is a myopic and toxic way to plan cities. This much has been proven by plenty of other places that have made worse mistakes than us. Next on our list is Solutions Utah, formerly the Pioneer Park Coalition, an organization that claims to promote aid for the unhoused in Salt Lake and that advocated strongly for the bill. Now, this might be a confusing position on the surface, as people who cannot afford a roof over their heads certainly cannot afford a car, but it makes sense once you see Solutions Utah's star-studded board, including infamous real estate investor Tiffany Price, business consultant Scott Howell, former Yale Crest Community Council chairwoman Jan Hemming, who thinks that the deaths of children do not justify speed bumps, Brian Hill, property manager at the Gateway, Suzanne Meitzen, director of retail for both the Grand and the Little America, John Gurr, associate broker at Internet Properties, and Ned Scanchi, partner at Urban Hive Properties. I wish, personally, that we had business and real estate interests that really wanted trains and bike lanes. But every single time a streets project comes up for public input, the business interests skew heavily towards the status quo. And the status quo is, unfortunately, wide, fast, dangerous streets and barely functional free street parking. For the last and perhaps most important interest, we'll throw out the fact that this provision is about streets entirely. Utah, as a state, doesn't have the home rule protections that keep the state out of each municipality's local business. So the state government is able and very willing to make power grabs and generally bully Salt Lake as it pleases. Standard blue city in a red state problem. See, as an example, the pride flag ban also passed last session that Salt Lake got around with official, Sago Lily emblazoned, flags. Not as cool as the whale flag, but a spot-on statement. The legislature certainly cannot disguise that the end goal of this bill is to force the city to prioritize high-speed, high-volume motor vehicle traffic over everything else they may want out of their streets. There's all sorts of clauses about impact analyses and evaluations and proactive consultations, but those are a very thin skin over the central tenet. This law isn't meant to gate street safety improvements behind some sort of holistic approval process. The approval process itself is meant to be so vague and onerous as to scare the city off from even trying. Since this process is so vague, you could say it creates a backdoor into every project for powerful people to step in and get what they want. We already had a whole block of the new 300 West Bikeway extension cut at the last minute and without comment. This was on UDOT territory, and SB 195 gives UDOT control over most of the city's territory as well, so I think it's a good example of what to fear. In their mobility plan, which is required under the new law in order to do anything, Salt Lake City has already been forced to pick their battles and has cut some projects or parts of projects from consideration entirely. Continuous and safer bike lanes on 8th South are out, and remember, those are a lot cheaper than extending the Sunnyside trails, which I'd love that. The long-heralded Grand Boulevards project on 2 of our fastest and most dangerous streets feels declawed, though we'll see what they can do with the turn lanes, and The Main Street pedestrianization that Mendenhall was pushing for ages might be abandoned. All of this is possible because of how incredibly vague SB 195 is. While it lists a few topics that UDOT and Salt Lake City have to study, it doesn't set any real criteria for approval or rejection of a given streets project, and it gives the final say straight to UDOT. Additionally, UDOT's own state-mandated assessment of fines, based on all sorts of available data and a very slanted survey, that's this whole thing, anywhere between a neutral/insignificant and a positive overall impact for every Salt Lake City street improvement from 2015 to present. Even through the lens of vehicle speeds and other congestion metrics only, UDOT was unable to show any significant impact. Measurable reductions in lane miles and on-street parking are damn near unnoticeable. And despite these findings, and despite the city already having completed many of their major street redesigns, thank you 2018 funding our future bond, UDOT still insists on preserving a slightly more car-centric status quo, whatever the cost. This all shows that projects will be decided on less by merit, say like the 9 line that made bicycling the whole city immeasurably better and driving that street safer and just as easy, and more on the whims of whoever has UDOT's ear at a given moment. Now, I've been circling around the actual text of the law, as most of it is more general power grab than meaningful technical detail, but I do want to break down the keystone, the definition of highway reduction strategy that dictates which projects are to be subject to UDOT's control. And I quote, "Highway reduction strategy means any strategy that has the potential to permanently decrease the number of vehicles that can travel on an arterial or collector highway per hour, including A, reducing the number of motorized vehicle travel lanes on an arterial or collector highway." Unquote. Now, the city isn't going around stealing lanes off of roads like they're in a Roadrunner cartoon. They develop and plan projects based directly on their 2015 Pedestrian and Bicycle Master Plan and their 2023 Citywide Transportation Plan. These plans were developed through years of highly collaborative work between the city, neighborhood councils, UTA, UDOT, the Wasatch Front Regional Council, and more. And at the end of that long process, City Council, who are, and I didn't think I'd have to stress this, elected by the voters of Salt Lake, adopts the general plans, and those plans guide all street projects for decades to come. This is where the impetus for our headline-busting construction projects comes from. Now, what seems to scare Senator Harper is that many of these voter-approved projects repurpose existing space in the street for new or different purposes. From a short-term status quo perspective, this may feel, and SB 195 frames it as, stealing away lanes that rightfully belong and have always belonged to private motorists. However, if you look back even slightly further in time, when downtown was packed with far more businesses and activity than it is today, you'll see that the city streets have always been changing, and what we have on the ground is only a temporary snapshot in time. Second South used to have trolley tracks running right down the middle, then those were torn out, and now just a couple years ago we installed dedicated bus lanes. There is no entitlement to space on the street. There is no fundamental status quo. There's just a 132-foot canvas and priorities that have always changed decade by decade. And I'll remind you that today's priorities include the Complete Streets Ordinance, which Salt Lake City passed to require safe pedestrian and bicycle accommodations in its own street reconstructions. We voted for this. So despite all these projects being consistent with the citywide plan and being subject to extensive public engagement and design processes of their own, they're now also subject to UDOT's whim. SB 195 claims to improve public involvement in city projects, but it doesn't.
I do appreciate the work you've done up in my neck of the woods and reaching out to our community. I think it's really important that the community has a say in how their city looks and changes, and every community in every city. So I like the framework that this puts into place that allows our cities to have as much say as possible, because we're the ones that are spending as much time there.
The sort of input it requires is a mere subset of what the city would already do, just compressed into one quick and messy plan. The public input gathered for this mobility plan is much less thorough and much less useful than that from per project input processes. I went to the one, and that's right, just one, open house held for all 18 projects combined into this mobility plan, only to find out that it had far less turnout than any single project event I'd ever been to, and most of the people there were like myself, people who go to public meetings to advocate generally for safe walking and biking infrastructure, and not so much the people the city wants to reach, the people directly affected by a project. I will also note that the information on the projects presented in this meeting was extremely limited and premature. Most of these projects were not ready to commit to like a particular lane configuration and so forth. If you recall the 21st South input process, the city and a vocal subset of residents that were very insistent on driving through Sugar House, despite apparently living right next to Sugar House, fought for months over the lane configuration. It wasn't decided on by a couple of staff rushing to prepare proposals for 17 other projects at the same time. It got to be its own big thing. So that's the impact on the big projects. They're much less democratic now, and the state will force down a huge bias towards whatever the lane configuration happened to be when they passed the law. Our next definition, B, narrowing existing motor vehicle travel lanes on an arterial or collector highway. Of course this impacts big projects, like Grand Boulevard's ability to enforce the posted speed limit with sane lane sizes instead of completely unmitigated shoulders, but it has a much more immediate impact on the small stuff. The city routinely adjusts lane striping on all sorts of streets as they undergo regular repaving. The city is required to apply its complete streets ordinance during these repavings instead of just reapplying the previous striping. So, given the opportunity, the city makes quick and inexpensive improvements to pedestrian and bicycle safety. Some highly successful examples of this include Main Street, which got 12 blocks of continuous and actually usable bike lanes after a chip seal, the boring end of 9th South, which really laid the groundwork for the 9 line, and 2nd, 3rd, 4th, and 5th East, 2nd and 3rd were first, 4th and 5th were much later, which try out a number of different styles of cheap painted bike lane and have made it a bajillion times easier to navigate the grid. These restripes provide the opportunity to try out different street configurations without committing any substantial funding or political capital. Again, 2nd and 3rd East really were experiments, and I hope we're learning from them. Unfortunately, SB 195 breaks this process. The city now has to waste money restriping streets multiple times, since their routine repaving process can't really be subject to unpredictable and fundamentally political decisions and schedules. They've got equipment and people to get on the streets. They'll also waste significant political capital pushing simple, cheap, and temporary projects through UDOT review. We've already seen harm done. The latest segment of 17th South, famous for its wildly dubious yet essentially positioned bike lanes, got repainted with the exact same striping it had before, instead of with geometric improvements to the bike lanes that would have made a real difference for safety. Many very simple safety improvements like this that could be achieved nearly for free during routine restriping will now simply be lost. Additionally, not being able to test out new lane configurations on different streets without a huge and expensive process will significantly complicate future high-budget projects. For example, now that Main Street's been running its 4-to-3 lane road diet for years and no Carmageddon has happened, it'll be a lot easier to maintain that configuration going into Sweet Street's mainline campaign, instead of having a big fight over whether a 4-to-3 will cause the end of the world. We could just prove that it literally hasn't. Alright, last definition we have C. Any other strategy that when implemented may increase congestion or impede traffic flow for motor vehicles driving on an arterial or collector highway. The city and the legislature are obviously hoping this provision will go opposite ways. The city that it means nothing, and the legislature that it means everything, like the original Substitute 3 listed. We won't know which one of these the reality will be until the approval process further cements itself, and this definition might flip-flop between nothing and everything, depending on the desires of powerful lobbyists. A great way to ensure that projects can proceed efficiently without wasting money. For me, I can tell you that the city doesn't want to, and certainly shouldn't have to, deal with the slow and unpredictable mobility plan process for very small projects like crosswalks, bulb outs, and constituent-driven CIPs. Now that you know all the lore and the sheer depth of SB 195's control over Salt Lake, we get to move to the action part of the video. The city will be filing their mobility plan for UDOT review shortly, and we, constituents of Salt Lake, have the opportunity to shape the battle they fight. Here are the asks I suggest you make of the city. Number 1, and these are in order on purpose, Prioritize zero fatalities. Speed and capacity on our roads cannot come before actual human lives, and there is no number of acceptable deaths caused by our transportation system. Number 2, continue executing the existing council, and by extension, voter-approved, general plans. Do not let the state undemocratically take these away. And within those plans, pick priority projects to focus the fight on. List the ones that matter to you. Number 3, redefine capacity in terms of people, not cars. Cars are just one of the many tools in our mobility toolbox, and if we want to have a climate-proof future, we got to use the whole toolbox. In this light, we ask that the city does not frame any streets projects as a fight between commuters and residents, because they're not. All of the projects seek to improve safety for all road users, including motorists. Bike lanes, sidewalks, crosswalks, and transit serve out-of-city commuters and tourists too. Just spend a few minutes people watching downtown and you'll see. And when you're writing your comment, I'd also suggest that you take a look at the report from UDOT's survey. It shows a keyword and sentiment analysis that is typical of large-scale surveys. So make it clear, even to someone just skimming, what sort of things that you want and what your overall feelings are about street safety. If you're in Salt Lake and you're feeling at all ready to make any sort of comment, I want you to stop watching this video right now, go grab the link to the comment form in the description, and just get your heart out on that page. We'll talk in the rest of this video about the Sunset Review coming in 3 years, but engaging right now is so much more important. Thankfully, I think, the Streets Power Grab is subject to a sunset review by the 2028 Transportation Interim Committee and would automatically be repealed in 2029 without action by the legislature. Common pattern for a wide variety of laws. As nice as this may sound, that committee seems to have flipped in sentiment towards the law. When it was originally passed, many legislators were caught off guard and voted nay just because of the Streets Power Grab. Now, legislators seem anywhere from ambivalent to fully on board. I'm not sure I fully understand this. Maybe it's because Salt Lake City is playing along as nicely as they can out of fear of future retribution from the state.
Differently. SB 195 has helped us. We're excited actually to bring you our product on November 19th. And we're grateful for this process that we've been through. You're going to see change.
Maybe it's because of the everyone drives bias that puts transportation bills in a unique position in front of an otherwise non-expert committee. Regardless, we need to prepare now for this fight by cataloging the harm SB 195 does to real Salt Lake City streets and real people on those streets. I've already mentioned 17th South losing out on simple lane line adjustments before the mobility plan was even started. There's also a bit of 700 East, all the way on the north road about South Temple, that was meant to get its lanes right-sized in a recent resurfacing, again, basically for free, but is now going to be a separate and more expensive project. You can see a full list of paving projects in the links in the description, and together we can track the before and after to identify wasted opportunities and state-forced violations of our own Complete Streets Ordinance. We also need to catalog the harm SB 195 does to the public input process. Go to per-project open houses and participate in comment forums. I fear we'll see designs baked in place much earlier on than they used to be. And recall that SB 195 has no provision for improved public input on individual projects. So the city deserves credit for any improvements that happen in that regard. Many of these are called for in the citywide transportation plan. And finally, although it's nearly impossible, we need to catalog injuries and deaths potentially caused by safety improvements that would have been built but were not built or were massively delayed because of SB 195. I'd start looking at fast and dangerous roads like the Grand Boulevards here. This is a lot to process, and I owe you all an apology for the format of the video. This is a clinically insane schedule to do this much research and writing on. I blame the bill. Puts everybody on a crazy schedule, the whole public input process. I'd like to thank everybody at the Sweet Streets Committee meeting on October 20th for helping unpack all that's happened during this month and for curing my nagging nihilism that I went into it with. And of course, extra thanks to everybody in the community that's been able to attend public input meetings and hearings and do investigative journalism. I think we're all resting at least a little bit on Building Salt Lake's shoulders. And as always, thank you to our patrons who are not getting early access to this video due to aforementioned schedule, but are getting a Halloween special. So look out for that, you guys. Roll the credits.